Hello, everybody, and thank you for attending today's seminar. I have the pleasure of introducing our seminar speaker today, Dr. Patrick Jantz. He is an assistant research professor in the Global Earth Observation and Dynamics of Ecosystems Lab here at NAU in the School of Informatics, Computing, and Cyber Systems. He obtained his PhD in environmental science and management from the University of California, Santa Barbara, and his research interests include forest structure, biodiversity, sustainable development, remote sensing, and geoinformatics. His talk today is titled Remote Sensing of Forest Structure in Colombia, Applications of Biodiversity and Conservation. Please join me in giving a warm welcome to Patrick. Thanks for being here.
Great, thank you, Gia, and thanks to the organizers, additional organizers, and Jantz for the invite. I know some of the folks over in forestry, and yeah, it's a great program. And yeah, thank you all for being here. So without further ado, assuming everybody can still hear me okay, let me know if you can't. We'll just fire up my PowerPoint here. And I have something like 45 minutes. Okay, cool. So this should be full screen for you all now. But yeah, so as Gia mentioned, I'm over at 6 and I work in the Geode lab with Scott Getz. So it's led by Scott Getz. And then other folks in the lab who've contributed to this project. And also I've got collaborators that I'd like to acknowledge: Susanna and Maria, Ralph, Hao, and Laura from Colombia, from the Humboldt Institute, as well as folks from the Amazon Institute in Colombia as well, called SINCHI, and then University of Maryland. And so the work that I'll be describing today is focused on remote sensing and forest structure in Colombia, applications for biodiversity and conservation, and it's primarily funded by NASA in support of the GeoBond work program. Right, so I'm sure in your program you probably have been exposed to some of these concepts of vegetation structure, a stand structure, and I think it has different meanings depending on what your focus is. So just as a bit of background, the way I'm thinking about it is kind of encapsulated pretty nicely by this figure from Fahey et al. In 2019, which essentially kind of divides canopy structure into 3 dimensions. This dimension of canopy openness, canopy height, and then canopy vertical complexity. So like the vertical distribution of canopy elements. And this doesn't have to be forest. It could be like a grass canopy or a wet canopy. But generally, we apply these ideas to forests. And this is more of a North American perspective, but similar ideas can be applied to the tropics. But yeah, essentially, when you look at forests on these 3 dimensions, you can classify forests into different kind of types, anywhere from a short, open forest to a tall, dense and multi-layered forest. And so these are the types of concepts I'm thinking about when describing forest structure and vegetation structure from a remote sensing perspective. And I think, as most of you probably know, vegetation structure and forest structure in particular in the tropics has been heavily impacted by human activities. And so this is a map of global forest change and deforestation over the 2000s, produced by Matt Hansen and his group at University of Maryland, with the warm colors showing deforestation. You can see significant forest loss in the tropics in South America, Congo Basin, and especially in Southeast Asia. So pretty large transformations to vegetation structure with implications for things like water cycling and nutrient cycling, and conservation, as we'll see. But just to give you a feel for what some of these transformations look like, this is a converted tropical dry forest in in Panama on the Azuero Peninsula. So this is an area that's been ranched for probably a couple hundred years. And so much of the forest has been converted for pasture. So essentially what we see are kind of remnant trees and maybe the odd forest fragment here and there. We see a lot of shifting agriculture in Africa. So this is an aerial shot in Uganda showing different stages of forest degradation and forest recovery in and around this subsistence shifting agricultural kind of area. And then in some places we do still have an intact forest, or primary forest as it's sometimes called. This is a view of that in the Amazon. So these are tall, dense forests, lots of understories, so complex vertical distribution of vegetation. There's canopy emergence, and yeah, so you kind of see the full range of different potential structural possibilities based on just the natural potential, but also human activities. Yeah, some of the motivations for this work come from the need to systematically and transparently map and monitor progress towards international agreements. So things like the Convention on Biological Diversity targets, as well as Sustainable Development Goals. So SDG 15 is, for example, is really heavily focused on sustainable forest management and maintenance of forest biodiversity and forest functions. And so one of the efforts that's kind of emerged in recent years is this idea of essential biodiversity variables. And those come from, or were inspired by essential climate variables. And the basic idea is that there's, we need to identify some subset of critical variables that we can use to report on and manage biodiversity change that gives us information on the status and trends and elements of biodiversity, and to use Earth observations in order to maintain consistency and transparency. Of course, combined with field measurements, so that we get the full range of scales for those types of measurements and monitoring programs. And so there's a wide range of EBVs. The one I've been involved with is the ecosystem structure EBV. And that's been defined as remote sensing measurements of cover or biomass. Could be something like LAI as well, the area index, by height or depth classes globally or regionally, to provide a three-dimensional description of habitats. And so you can see just from this diagram why that might be useful and might help us get beyond kind of like a 2D percent cover approach. So there's this kind of caricature of a tropical forest showing, these understory plants, understory trees, palms, lianas, and then the canopy itself, and then canopy emergence. So a lot of structure there that we basically miss if we focus on a 2D percent cover perspective. And so essentially one of the things that I've been interested in this project is, we're interested in vegetation structure because we know it influences important kind of ecosystem processes. But we also think that that it might help us identify areas that are high in biodiversity, or at least unique in biodiversity. And so one thing that we started with in this project was trying to understand, just kind of first principles, why might we expect there to be a relationship between biodiversity and forest structure? And so there's several out there, a couple that helped inform our work. I'm showing here, so this is Stein et al. In 2014, with this idea of environmental heterogeneity as a driver of species richness. And importantly, they include vegetation environmental heterogeneity as kind of one of those elements of an environmental heterogeneity, and they essentially define it as the physical structure of vegetation and its taxonomic or functional composition. But the idea is that heterogeneity should be positively related to species richness across taxa, kind of in a general sense. And so they conducted a meta-analysis of many, many studies from plants to vertebrates to invertebrates as the response variables. And so everywhere from the tropics to the boreal regions. So pretty comprehensive. But interestingly, they did find pretty consistent and pretty strong positive relationships between biodiversity across all of these taxa and elements of vegetation structure, so things like vegetation dimension and vegetation complexity. So that was kind of an encouraging to see that pretty broad scale relationship. One thing we were interested in was tree diversity specifically. And there's a paper out in 2016 by Marx et al. That invoked this idea of environmental harshness as something that constrains the suite of species that can exist in a certain place. But the basic idea is that the tree height is an integrative indicator of environmental harshness. So it kind of has echoes of the site index, I think, that's used in forestry sometimes. But basically, the idea is that regions with less niche space, i.e. that are more harsh, should have lower tree diversity, and those with greater niche space and therefore greater niche volume should have higher species richness. And so essentially they make the prediction that tree species richness should scale with tree height. And so that was really interesting to see that kind of perspective. But that's essentially what they found in a FIA analysis, so forest inventory analysis. Comparison of max height of trees and alpha species richness. And so that's the richness of trees at a particular plot. And that's a little bit different than beta and gamma diversity, which you also may be familiar with. Gamma is kind of the overall number of species in a region, and beta would be the turnover of species from place to place. But yeah, so this pretty strong relationship here between tree species richness and max height. And so that really, we were pretty intrigued by that because we've got, ways to map and measure forest height now from space. And we wanted to see if there was some way we could use those measurements to try to inform our understanding of biodiversity patterns and conservation. But just to note, there's a lot of other factors that are involved in why we see forest structure the way we see it on the landscape, and that essentially flows from kind of the broader context of climate and soils through to species composition and functional traits. But especially anthropogenic disturbances, we see a lot of successional processes happening, and those all come together to basically form the forest landscapes that we observe. Natural disturbance as well. I know a lot of folks in AU are interested in fire. But yeah, just to acknowledge that those are also processes that are at work, kind of multiple spatial and temporal scales on the landscape. So I've talked a bit about structure, and of course, one of the issues is how you measure it. It can be quite difficult to make manual measurements for reasonably large areas and within a decent amount of time. So one of the kind of the best ways we have right now, and quite accurate ways, is with Lidar. So that's light detection and ranging. And some of you may be familiar with it, some of you might not. But essentially, it's it's a laser range finding approach. And so we've got an instrument, it's got a laser on it, it emits a laser pulse, it hits a target, and then the instrument times, it calculates the amount of time it took for the pulse to be returned from the target. So in this case, these are some isolated trees in the landscape, and the aircraft is flying over them. It's shooting a laser pulse down, and with each laser pulse, there are multiple returns. So the first return generally strikes the top of the canopy. Some other parts of the laser pulse make it partway through the canopy, and then they're returned, and so forth. So you can get multiple returns, kind of start to outline the structure of the canopy, and then finally, as long as there's not 100% cover or occlusion of the ground, the pulse eventually hits the ground and is then returned. And so you get essentially a full kind of 3D picture of the landscape with Lidar measurements. And you can see a bit of a shadow there under that tree. It's relatively dense, and so there might actually be full occlusion there in some small areas, but generally does a pretty good job of estimating canopy structure. I'm sure some of you folks have worked with aircraft LiDAR and potentially terrestrial LiDAR as well. But essentially for kind of plot to regional scale applications, aircraft LiDAR has been the go-to for a lot of work. There's another kind of LiDAR in addition to discrete return, which is called waveform. The concept is the same, but the digitizer, instead of digitizing discrete returns, it actually digitizes all the energy that's returned from the laser pulse. And so we get a little bit of a high resolution view of the vertical distribution of vegetation. And we can extract several different metrics from that waveform, so things like canopy height, surface topography. If the laser penetrates all the way to the ground, we get various canopy height metrics, canopy cover metrics, and then vertical structure metrics. So yeah, those are just a couple of the ways that we have measured more recently vegetation structure in a more automated way. And there is a history of using LiDAR to relate to measurements of biodiversity. So here's a couple from our lab showing positive relationships between, say, bird species richness and canopy height in the northeastern US, and then improvements of bird species distribution models in Sonoma County in California that Pat Burns led recently. So there's a lot of interest in using these types of measurements to understand distributions of biodiversity. And there's even more interest now with the development of the Jedi Lidar. And so this is global ecosystem dynamics investigation. And we work a lot with this, with the Jedi team in our lab. So there's a recent paper out on it, and you can check it out at jedi.umd.edu. Essentially, it's kind of the first vegetation-specific LiDAR that we've been able to get from space. So it started collecting data in 2019. It's a waveform LiDAR. The footprints are a little coarse, they're 25 meters. So at about kind of a forest stand scale. And we do lose a little bit of kind of the spatial representation of the vegetation, but we still get pretty good vertical resolution within those 25-meter footprints. And we've got several billion shots now, several billion high-quality measurements from Jedi, from 50 degrees north to 50 degrees south. So kind of a quantum leap in the number of structure observations that we're able to work with now. There's some geolocation error associated with the measurements. So it's about 10 meters. And this is an issue if you want to try to link up, say, Jedi with a specific field plot. But if you're linking up Jedi with satellite imagery, or if you're summarizing structure over some larger area, it's not as big a deal. And the mission is extended to 2023, and hopefully Jedi will stay on the space station. Ultimately, it's slated to come off and be decommissioned, but hopefully we can keep it on there at least until 2023, because we're getting great measurements, and there's a lot of applications yet to be explored. So it's not a wall-to-wall coverage, so it's a sampling Lidar. Here's just a schematic of how that looks. And so 25-meter footprint separated by 60 meters along track and 600 meters across track. And there's a couple of different types of beams. And in general, these do a good job of penetrating canopy. The full power lasers can penetrate denser canopy, but we tend to get our best measurements from both during night, because there's less interference from the sun. So just a little bit about the pattern of measurements that we see from Jedi. And here's the first year of acquisitions. So this is RH100, so you can think of this as canopy height. And the color scheme is a little washed out here, but you can see some of the warmer colors in the tropics and Pacific Northwest, for example, the southeastern US show higher canopy heights. And blue is low canopy height or no vegetation. But yeah, so this 50 degrees north, 50 degrees south cutoff, that's actually due to the orbit of the space station. So it simply just doesn't orbit beyond that. And then you can also see that it orbits in this kind of crosshatch pattern. So we end up with this, this essentially set of transects in any given place. And over the next year, and actually even now, a lot of those gaps are starting to fill in because the orbit of the space station has changed. And so there are some gaps, and there always will be gaps, but we're starting to reduce the size of those and filling in coverage, which is really good to see. Yeah, this is just kind of a view. This is actually a little bit compressed laterally, so it exaggerates the density of the shots. They're more spread out in reality, but this is more just to let you see the types of kind of vertical measurements we get from Jedi. So you can see that captures vegetation canopies with dense upper canopy and an open lower canopy, ones with relatively uniform canopies, short dense and short open canopies, and that's shown in green. And surface elevation is on the y-axis, and then the waveforms themselves, which I mentioned previously, are these. There's just an example of how these look at the top. And so you can see usually there's a peak around 0, and that's the ground return. And so we need to find that if we're actually able to understand what's happening above the ground. And so again, in very dense or canopies or during the day with the weak beam, sometimes we don't get that ground return, and we can't really tell where the rest of the canopy is in relation to the ground. But yeah, so just a little bit about the data structure and pattern that we tend to see. So stepping back a little bit, we were interested in this, exploring this relationship between, essentially, what does forest structure look like across a landscape, and then how does it relate to tree species diversity? And our partners are in Colombia, and we got lucky. There was one set of Lidar acquisitions in the northwest of the country that were co-located with forest inventory plots. So we were able to link up Lidar measurements with multi-spectral remote sensing measurements to basically be able to map forest structure across the entire Choco ecoregion. And then, we were also interested in investigating the relationship between tree diversity and forest structure using those plots. And if we were able to observe a strong relationship, and that would potentially allow us to map those patterns of diversity out across the landscape with those wall-to-wall estimates of forest structure. And that's essentially what what we did find. I'll describe it a little more detail, but just to orient you geographically. So Colombia is in the northwest part of South America, and there's like 5 major ecoregions: the Amazon in the south, the Orinoco, the Andes, the Caribbean, and then we focused on the Choco for this analysis because that's where our forest inventory plots were, and that's where the Lidar acquisitions were. And this is, it's one of the wettest places on Earth, several thousand centimeters of vegetation or of precipitation every year. It's really, really wet, and also one of the richest tropical forests in the world, just based on the field inventories that have been done there. It's a really interesting place to work, and a really good test case for this relationship between forest structure and biodiversity, because yeah, the patterns are a lot different than where we've seen most of the work before, which was more in temperate forests. But yeah, so we had a set of field plots in the Choco. We actually extended out a bit, just to grab some different forest types, primarily drier forest types. So we included some plots from Brazil where we had Lidar and forest inventory plots to build the models. You can see in this lower right panel D that we've got Lidar coverage in green and our vegetation plots in blue. And there's some overlap there with the Lidar flew over the vegetation plots, and it's not complete coverage. It was just designed to capture a decent variability within the ecoregion, which is good. But if we're interested in what's going on between these gaps, we've got to extrapolate if we can. And yeah, panel C is just showing kind of the broad land cover types. So most of it's intact forest, but there are some wetland forests in the northeast, secondary vegetation where there's been disturbance, primarily in the north and the south. And then, yeah, some scattered settlements along rivers and so forth. But that's the general kind of setup that we were working with. So yeah, kind of the first question that we could ask with these, or that we were interested in asking with these data, is what's the relationship between the aircraft Lidar canopy height and other metrics and the alpha tree species richness at those same plots. And if there's no relationship, then that kind of precludes any sort of broader mapping with other remote sensing data sets. But what we found was that canopy height was and other canopy metrics, vertical canopy heterogeneity, 50th percentile of heights, and standard deviation of heights from the Lidar. Those were all strongly and positively correlated with species richness, as well as other diversity metrics that kind of make different weightings of the species abundance. But yeah, so kind of overall pretty strong relationships across these plots. And so, yeah, this is on the top left. This is just an example of what the point cloud might look like for one of those plots. So canopy heights on the y-axis and latitude is on the x-axis, so showing kind of different returns. So a lot of it's in the upper canopies and dense understory. And these are the types of measurements we linked up with the field plots. And so these were like linear relationships. And then we also did a random forest analysis. And again, canopy height, CH abbreviated here, lined up well with most of the diversity richnesses, or the most important for predicting the diversity metrics, along with elevation. And then, some of the other variables like temperature and some of the other structure metrics were less important, and precipitation kind of brought up the rear. But yeah, so pretty strong relationships, just at the plot scale. And so with that, we were interested to see how these maps looked if we extrapolated that relationship out with our wall-to-wall canopy maps of canopy height that were based on that relationship between aircraft Lidar and multi-spectral imagery. And so here's a Sentinel-2 composite, just to give you a feel for what know what that might look like. So dark green is denser vegetation, light green is less dense vegetation, and then kind of brown and yellow is low stature or vegetation. Yeah, so we're able to develop reasonably good canopy height maps for the Choco, showing kind of lower forests in these wetland or inundated areas, seasonally inundated in some cases. Taller forests, in some cases up to 50 meters in the upland areas, and then kind of, just varying landscape features also visible. But our RMSE was on the order of 7 meters, so some noise. Relative error was 25% or thereabout. But when we did some model cross-validation, and the models for richness were reasonably good, species richness, and that's shown in this right panel, of about 6 to 7 species RMSE, or a relative error of about 17%. What's interesting is that we see some pretty strong gradients in estimated species richness or predicted species richness. And we looked through the literature to look at some floristic surveys to see how this pattern lined up with what's been observed. And it lines up pretty well. The reports are scattered, but generally the wetland or inundated forests tend to be lower species richness, and that's what we see here. And then some of the upland forests, so there's this gradient from inundated to upland forests where we see an increase in species richness. But some of the highest species richness areas are along the Pacific coast here in these upland regions, but also along the Andes to Amazon, Andes to lowland, sorry, not Amazon, Andes to lowland Choco forest transition. And those are kind of well-known areas of elevated species richness. So we felt pretty good about kind of the overall pattern of the maps that we saw. And again, kind of some of the summaries of species richness by land cover type also made sense. We generally see lower species richness and secondary vegetation, which tends to be dominated by like common pioneer species. And then these wetland land cover types tend to be the lowest in species number. So that kind of brought us to this next step of, we've kind of established some interesting relationships in the Choco, but there are other really big forest areas in Colombia that have, really good forest inventory information. So here's the Amazon as an example. We've got field plots distributed across the Amazon. These are permanent 1 hectare plots, and they're stem mapped, and so they know where the trees are in each one. But we don't actually have co-located Lidar information for them, and so it's difficult to try to understand what the relationship is between vegetation structure and diversity is here. They do have some limited height measurements, but not for all the plots, and they're not particularly high resolution. And so one of the questions for us was, can we kind of adapt some of the approaches from the Choco and use them with our collaborators in the Amazon to see, kind of understand what those relationships are between vegetation structure and tree diversity there. And so essentially the first step with that is to link up Jedi measurements with multi-spectral imagery. So as you'll recall, most of Colombia doesn't have aircraft LiDAR measurements, but with Jedi, we've got now hundreds of thousands of pretty high quality measurements across the entire country. Here's an example of what that looks like in the Choco. So you see some dropouts because of clouds and so forth, but it extends our number of measurements of vegetation structure in the Choco considerably. And the same is true in the Amazon. So we took that same approach to link up, in this case, the Jedi LiDAR with multi-spectral and synthetic aperture radar imagery to create canopy structure maps or vegetation structure maps for the entire country. And so this is what's shown in this left-hand map. Darker blue colors are taller canopies, and brown and yellow colors are shorter canopies. So you see there's lots of heterogeneity across the country. Much of the Andes is settled, and so there's a lot of forest clearing there, integrated forest, a lot of integrated dry forest, Orinoco's naturally a savanna ecosystem, and then the Amazon, which is largely intact, but there are areas of degradation that are starting to creep in, especially from the northwest. And one thing you'll notice is this kind of striping artifacts in the in the canopy height map, and that's due to anisotropy. And so essentially that's the uneven distribution of reflected light that's picked up by the sensor. Essentially what that means is that in the center of a sentinel scene, in this case, there's bias in the way that the sensor registers reflectance from the forest, and that bias increases the closer to the scene edges you get. But we know how to correct for that, and we're currently doing that. The assets available on Earth Engine when we did this work did not have that correction, but we figured out that correction and are applying it now. So the next map should be more consistent and should actually improve our estimates of canopy height too, because those errors won't be fed into our models. But basically, we see errors ranging from 5 to 9 meters RMSE, highest in the Choco. So those are really dense, complex forests, reasonable in the Amazon, and lowest in the Orinoco. So a lot of variability, but reasonably good first cut at these canopy structure maps. We expect to see improvements in them as we go forward. But right, and so we've got these canopy structure metrics, and they're gridded. And so they're estimates from this modeling process from the Jedi Lidar, from the SAR and Multi-Spectral to these gridded products of canopy height. But then we said, okay, well, we know it's going to be noisier because there's geolocation error, there's model error, but do we see positive relationships between canopy structure and species richness in these Amazon plots? And the answer is yes. So we see still strong positive relationships between species richness, tree species richness, and canopy height in the Amazon. So that was really cool because the Amazon and the Choco are different forests, different trees, different disturbance regimes, different precipitation regimes, all that. So it's kind of cool to see that. And the models are noisier. So RMSE is on the order of 14 species, and MAE, absolute error, I think, is the order of 9 species. So it's they're not performing as well as we'd like, but we still capture some interesting gradients. And we've talked to our collaborators at Sinchi, and they indicate essentially that these are realistic gradients. We do see lower species diversity in some of these Varzea and seasonally inundated areas, definitely in the secondary forests. And one thing we'll be exploring more is kind of the gradients that we see in some of these more internal and less disturbed forests to make sure that we're getting those right and what might be causing them. So anyway, kind of an interesting set of findings and stuff that's still in progress. My postdoc who was working on that, Camilo Fagua, he recently took a tenure track position at the National University in Colombia. So he's really interested in pushing this work forward. And we have a PhD student in our lab, Ivan Gonzalez, who's a great programmer. And he is working with Sinchi to develop kind of a web application that links up, kind of just Jedi data for exploring, but also we'll be putting in our canopy height maps and our species richness maps, and Sinchi has biomass maps, and they're really interested in kind of education and outreach to identify kind of places that have multiple ecosystem co-benefits. So things like carbon sequestration and biodiversity. And ultimately, they report to the Environment Ministry. And so to the extent that, that some of this information can be useful for decision making in the Amazon, that would be really cool too. So definitely ongoing work in that vein, and we're wrapping up those forest structure maps and Amazon diversity maps as we speak. But just kind of taking a broader view now of like this idea of forest structure and environmental or ecological integrity. Another project that's related to this is really focused on working with Colombia and a couple of other countries in South America to develop voluntary metrics for reporting on forest quality for SDG 15. So many of the kind of standard metrics for SDG 15 focus on forest extent or forest cover, but we're essentially trying to make the case, because we've seen, with these analyses in Colombia and analyses from other places in the tropics, that the structural condition of the forest is also important to consider, as is human impacts. And so part of this project, we developed this essentially a ecologically informed forest structural integrity index, with the idea that that forests with better structural condition and low human pressure, and those are shown in green, should potentially maintain more biodiversity and more ecological processes than those that they might have high structural condition, but are impacted by humans, so they've got greater human pressure, or maybe that they're so degraded that they've lost considerable structure and therefore can't maintain some of the critical ecological processes that we associate with forests. And so, this is just kind of a coarse, kind of pantropical attempt to try to push this idea of ecological integrity as something that we can start to get at with remote sensing and Earth observations, and that should be used to inform some of the reporting that goes on at the national scale. And so in terms of Earth observations, this uses satellite imagery from Landsat, and includes estimates of forest cover, forest height, and time-sensitive disturbance. So we've got a few papers that essentially outline that approach and some of its implications. But yeah, what's interesting is that essentially some of the logical outcomes from that are a set of recommendations for management and policy, anywhere from maintaining or improving protection down to restoring integrity, based on some of the vegetation structural metrics and indices of human pressure that we can map now reasonably well across the tropics. Of course, it's not perfect, but this is really just to try to get this idea into the discussion, so that countries can focus more on forest quality instead of just forest extent, which is how some of the metrics are written now. And what's really cool is that we actually, as part of this project, we received an award. Actually, UNDP partners received an award because they're doing a really good job of taking some of our scientific products and delivering them to partners on the ground in Colombia, Peru, and Ecuador. And so that came from their EO4 SDG, Earth Observations for Sustainable Development Goals programs. That was really nice to see that there's some starting to be some uptake of some of these Earth observation products in official reporting. So that's essentially what I've got. I think the next steps for this work, we've looked at tree species diversity, but much of the animal diversity in the tropics is actually arboreal. So I forget what the percentage is, but considerable percentage of species actually live in the trees, or rely on resources from trees, like fruit dropping from the trees. For yeah, basically for sustenance. And so one thing that we're interested in doing is taking some of these approaches of mapping Jedi wall to wall with multi-spectral imagery and combining that type of information with camera trap data of tropical forest species to better understand, how structure influences species distributions, species ranges, and whether we can use this type of information to inform decision making on biodiversity. And so we're pushing this work forward in Colombia and Southeast Asia. And this is primarily Pat Burns and Scott Getz. We're working on this. But yeah, so with that, I'll just wrap up and take any questions. And if we don't get to them here, feel free to email me, patrick.jantz@nau.edu. And yeah, I appreciate you all tuning in, and hopefully this is one of the last Zoom webinars that we'll have to sit through, and we can be in person next time.
Thanks, Patrick. If people want to unmute themselves for questions, that's fine, or you can put them in the chat and I will go ahead and read them out loud.
Thanks, Pete.
We have a question from Carol. She says, how easy is it to get Lidar data from countries in Central and South America? The data looks really useful.
Yeah, some of it depends on on who acquired the data. In this case, we had a NASA collaborator who acquired those data in the Chocó in Colombia, and he was willing to share them with us. Unfortunately, they're not publicly available, and essentially, as far as I know, those are the only data that are available for Colombia. For Peru and Ecuador, for Peru, there might be a little bit through the Brazil Sustainable Landscapes Program. And those, I think, because they're funded by the U.S. Forest Service, or at least they're partnered with the U.S. Forest Service, some of those might actually be open source and publicly available. But essentially, right now, it's actually pretty difficult, and we're frustrated. We're happy to find that data set and help, provide some insights, but we could certainly use more. Anyone else?
Looks like we have a question from Sam. I'm not sure if this is an acronym or I'm supposed to say it out loud, but I'm not familiar with remote sensing. But does GEODE have any ongoing work in Vietnam?
So GEODE, that's actually the acronym for our lab, the Global Earth Observation and Dynamics of Ecosystems Lab. And I frequently forget what the acronym means myself. But let's see, we, as part of that Southeast Asia species distribution mapping, we do, although I'm not entirely sure what the status of it is. We've mostly been working on the island of Borneo because that's where we have the best data. But I'm relatively sure that we have some camera traps in Vietnam. And so I guess the answer is yes, but it hasn't gotten up to full speed right now. And I think it is focused primarily on like forest animals. And so depending on what your interests are, if it's more like forest biomass or forest structure, we're not essentially as up to speed as we might be.
Another question from Pete. He asked, I didn't have a clear understanding of the errors in the species richness modeling. Is there a metric such as plus or minus X or plus or minus times number of species?
Yeah, so essentially, I think what we did, and I have to check with Camila to be certain, but I'm pretty sure we did like a cross-validation, and maybe like a withhold validation set as well. But essentially what we came up with is a plus or minus, essentially a root mean squared error of the number of species at a, essentially the average error across the cross validation. And for the Amazon, I believe the RMSE was like 14 species. And the relative error, gosh, I guess that might be up around 20 or 30% relative to the total number of species at a given site. And then for the Choco, the RMSE was around 7 species, and that relative error was something around 20%. But I will note that we did have like a 10 centimeter DBH cutoff in both of those surveys. And so, those, if we had included a lot of the smaller trees, we have much higher levels of species richness, and I'm not sure that our models would have worked as well, because the larger trees I think contribute more to structure than the smaller trees do in general. But that's something we might be able to look at once we're able to track down more field data sets. So it looks like a comment from Nadine. Thanks for that, Nadine. I was really focused on aircraft LiDAR with that question from Carol, but it is true that all of the Jedi data are freely available and can be downloaded from the ORNL DAC, so the Distributed Active Archive System. But we actually have a lot of those data on Monsoon. Actually, most of the data I think we've ingested, because we tend to have to work with Jedi data from across the world. And so if there's a place that you're interested in, you could email me and we could window out some of the data for you, just to see, it's transects and there's dropouts from clouds and stuff, but it's filling in more. So anyway, thanks for that. Right, and so link is at jedi.umd.edu. And yeah, so Pete, and yeah, RMSE of 14, it's pretty good. I think we can get it down a little bit, but we were happy with it, given that we've got these 30-meter pixels that we're linking up with 1 hectare plots, and so we weren't entirely sure that we were going to get reasonable relationships, but so far it looks good.
Any other questions? Well, with that, I want to say thanks again for joining us, and we will have the discussion right after this, probably meet about 5 or a little after. So if folks want to take a quick break, yeah, we can head over there and I will put that discussion link in the chat. Thanks everyone for attending.
Great, thank you all. Appreciate it.